The city of Mons, where the English first encountered the Germans in 1914, was now behind us. Here and there, tall chimneys, mine derricks, grotesque slag heaps and coal stockpiles arose from the ground like big black cones, some as high as 100 metres, almost blocking out a golden sunset. This is a bleak corner of Belgium with few trees, one mine after the other, and streets and lanes lined with endless rows of ugly, characterless terraced houses, all overlooked by the ever-present cone-shaped slag heaps. Was it not here where Vincent van Gogh had once resided, and where he had forsaken his lay-preaching days? No sooner had we left the endless urban sprawl behind us than we came across a long line of bunkers and forts stretching either side and across the road. This was the French border with its northwestern extension of the Maginot Line, and only a few kilometres away stood the huge French fortress of Valenciennes. The place looked terrible. The centre of town was little more than a heap of rubble, and in other parts barely a single house remained untouched. In a relatively undamaged sector from which everyone else appeared to have fled, we came upon a small group of old women, a few children and dogs wandering aimlessly around. Numerous bridges and emergency crossings had meanwhile been erected by our engineers over the waterways, yet even then we were forced to make frequent detours away from the built-up areas. From Douai it was on to Arras through France's northern industrial region, where the towns are drab and colourless and consist in large part of low grey-red brick houses lacking any front garden. The streets are lined mile upon mile with almost identical dwellings where only a handful of people remain, who either sit listlessly on their doorsteps or stand at the crossroads. To my amazement, we come across places where small groups of German soldiers were engaged in laughing conversation with young boys and girls. Now and again, a motorbike messenger roared by in the direction we had come, or towards the front, while overhead a bomber or two were either flying home to base or venturing out in search of fresh targets. We were now among the trenches of the Great War close to Arras, an area that was empty, flat and treeless. On the fringe of a broad green field lay the wreck of a French airplane, and nearby we came upon an airfield littered with the remains of countless planes. In between the wrecks, German fighters and bombers were busy landing and taking off. All around Arras one could see clear traces of the Great War, principally in the unnatural undulation of the fields and meadows. Close to where the ground falls away towards the town, and where the English and German front lines had once been almost parallel with each other, there had been a modern-day tank battle, and rust-brown wrecked armoured vehicles appeared to have joined the fray from the north. The encircled French units had clearly made an unsuccessful attempt to break out to the south and southwest. In Arras, a town known to nearly every Englishman who had fought there in the Great War, we were quartered for the night in an evacuated school building. Passing through the centre, I could see there had been heavy fighting there. Most houses showed signs of damage. Some were riddled with holes, while others had collapsed completely. The boulevards on the outer fringes of town, where first the town's citizens, then French and English troops and latterly German soldiers had sought shelter from air attacks, were filled with endless columns of stalled and burned-out vehicles, piles of uniforms and army equipment along with mounds of straw and earth from freshly dug trenches. The Army Motor Vehicle Depot, which, after much haggling, finally assigned a truck to me for my continued journey, was stationed in the garages of a former French sappers unit and stood in close proximity to what was our first German military cemetery in France. While individual English and French graves were often dotted all around, complete with helmet and wooden cross, our men were buried together in a single field. I resumed my journey under cool and cloudy skies, passing through a sparsely populated and thinly treed area, from where I caught a glimpse of a distant red and white monument to the fallen of the Great War. It reminded me of a structure I had once put together as a small boy with my toy building blocks. This was possibly the Canadian Vimy Memorial erected in the 1930s. The villages here were so run down and dirty that they reminded me of Poland. The overall use of corrugated iron sheets for all manner of purposes, such as fencing and stable roofs, was clearly an example of old abandoned Great War material being recycled. It helped to have knowledge of recent history when covering the somewhat tedious stretch of road from Bapaume, Albert, to Amiens. All buildings around the Cathedral of Amiens had been levelled, making the undamaged church appear twice its size. The clearing of rubble from the roads was well underway, which allowed us to drive right through town. although to our left and right there was much confusion. Amiens was now home to an occupation garrison of about 60 or 70 men who had, however, not yet been able to catalogue the vast French supplies held in storage, and the few remaining citizens were busy plundering the depot and dragging away anything they could lay their hands on. There was also a rumour in Amiens that 150 English soldiers were buried beneath the rubble in what had been an air raid shelter, but it wasn't until we reached a small village somewhere between Amiens and Rouen that we first set eyes on live Englishmen who had been put to work clearing rubble. Further on, the whole character of the countryside began to change again. The terrain was dotted with small hills, countless hedgerows and small thickets reducing visibility to no more than 50 metres in any direction. There were no smooth-barked trees here, but instead a dense growth that snaked itself in jungle-like fashion around all stems, trunks and limbs. From time to time, we bypassed a windmill, and then a fresh breeze brought with it the smell of the sea, and the countryside once again resembled that of southern England. In Forges-sur-Eau, we changed vehicles and sent our old truck back to Arras before proceeding at a high rate of speed towards Rouen. I was a passenger in a railway engineer battalion truck. Not until we reached the high ground immediately in front of the city and had descended into the Seine Valley was the countryside marked by any sign of fighting, and then it was only scattered English army vehicles that had been driven into the ditch that reminded me we were still at war. Only upon entering the city through the easternmost suburbs and looking over to the far shore of the Seine did we notice the smoke and flames of oil tanks that had been set alight by retreating English or French troops. The centre of Rouen impressed me greatly by its medieval, almost Hanseatic appearance. 3 churches and the town hall with their marvellous Gothic towers provided clear evidence of the illustrious history of this mighty old river port. Since all apartment dwellings had been barricaded and locked by the French police, and a German city commander had yet to make his presence felt, we spent the night under the stars. And only the next day did we expropriate an apartment for the night. The flat had small, clean rooms, and was for the most part tastefully furnished, much of which, however, harkened back to the plush, stuffed cushion era of around 1900. The bed covers on the bed into which I crept had been folded back, the master's nightshirt carefully laid out, and his slippers placed where he could easily slip them on. Next morning I bade Captain von Schwanker and his 25 officer cadets farewell, and joined a motorized detachment belonging to a tank regiment. Leaving the city with its harbour to my right, we came upon the remains of the single largest bridge over the Seine. Apparently, in order to delay the Germans from reaching the south shore, while still packed with vehicles and fleeing refugees, it had been blown up, and the rumour prevailed that about 150 people had died, including a prefect. Salvage work was already in progress, and bodies of civilians, French and English soldiers, were being pulled out of the oily water and loaded onto trucks. Those were frightful images. A quick drive to the southeast brought us to Les Andelys, where the bridge had been skillfully dynamited, forcing all traffic to cross over pontoon bridges erected by our engineers. The first bridge lay immediately to the south of the town, beneath an old picturesque castle, set high on bare, chalk-coloured rocks overlooking the river. Here my driver had to remain behind, so I descended and sought out alternate transport, which I succeeded in securing with a detachment of a tank destroyer unit possessing among its many vehicles several English Bedford cars. It was interesting to note that in design and manufacture of these English cars, no one had thought it necessary to curb their speed capabilities, and they ran effortlessly at 100 kilometres an hour or more, and, unlike the rough growl of our own cross-country vehicles, their engines purred sweetly. In sweltering heat, we drove up out of the Seine Valley content in the knowledge that our Luftwaffe fighters were keeping the RAF at bay. At one point, where the road narrows through a wood, and from where, through the shimmering heat, I could look back and make out a curve in the river, we came upon a French column that had been overtaken by our panzers. Slowly we steered our vehicles between the wrecked wagons, horse cadavers, overturned trucks, the contents of which were scattered far and wide, while off to the side on the verge lay the dead, who were mostly Africans. The day-long heat had created such an overwhelmingly nauseating stench that we eagerly lit up our English cigarettes before examining the scattered supplies, which were also all of English origin. During a rest period, An NCO was thus able to offer us the booty of cooked ham, roast beef, and tins of jam, and when opening one of the wrecked vehicle's glove compartment, he also came upon a yellow tin marked granulated sugar. In that particular corner of Normandy, the landscape changed once again and more closely resembled the flat land around Albert and Bapaume. Without the hindrance of hedges, hillocks and woods one could see for miles, and while at first there was no trace of war, when driving on we came across the occasional abandoned roadblock, a few destroyed bridges and tipped-over English vehicles, and later learned there had indeed been fierce and costly fighting against elements of the retreating enemy. During the course of the afternoon, I came upon the 15 Panzer Corps command post, 4–5 kilometres southwest of a small town called Mortagne. There I met an ordnance officer who was keen to take a casual drive in his own car and was willing to deliver me to the forward position of the 6th Infantry Division to which the 58th Regiment belonged. In Longny we reached the divisional supply route, and from there a motorised unit of a machine-gun battalion delivered me to the headquarters of the 6th Infantry Division, where I made a brief report to the divisional commander Count von Biegerleben, before continuing on to the regiment which lay in Remoulade, a small town on the river Illouin. Arriving at sundown, I descended from my ride just as the men were having their evening meal. The battalion commander, Colonel Clampt, cordially invited me to sit and join them. The food was made up in part from our own bread supply, local fresh white bread of which there was plenty, tinned meat, and, as a substitute for sleep, good French wine. 1 hour later, Colonel von Tresco came over to sit with his fellow officers, and under the lights, I made a point of studying the many faces around me. Later, when lying in bed under a wide-open window, it occurred to me that unless something decisive was planned, which I sincerely doubted, there might no longer be an opportunity for me to prove myself in the face of the enemy, although, by this time, I had almost reached the point where I no longer cared. After leaving Dreiberg, I had been sure that within 5 or 6 days I would get my marching orders and be in the thick of it, but then 5 whole weeks had elapsed, and despite my numerous telephonic pleas, I had arrived too late. Let no one say I didn't do my best. That aside, when comparing the reception I received following my transfer to Signals Detachment 76 to the one received here, I felt sure I was going to enjoy my new posting. The mood, from the commander on down, was truly inspirational, and I was happy to be part of this unit. I also noted with satisfaction how, unlike my previous commander, who from time to time took pleasure in treating me with contempt for having had the temerity to anger the Army High Command with my persistent marriage requests, I was no longer an embarrassment and singled out for verbal abuse. For orientation, I was ordered to remain for the next few days with the 14th Company of the Motorized Anti-Tank Regiment. The overall plan was for the Panzer Division to pursue the enemy to the south, while at the same time try not to outdistance the infantry divisions on either flank. However, since resistance from the retreating enemy was getting weaker, the Panzer Division made rapid progress, and in doing so, put the unfortunate infantry under great pressure to keep up. On the 18th of June, in the burning heat, the regiment drove all the way from Remoulade to the Sarthe River, crossing approximately 15 kilometres north of Le Mans, a distance of roughly 60 kilometres, and on the last stretch, from the village of Beaufy to the Sarthe, every available vehicle, including those of the 14th Company, were assigned to bring up the infantry, so that by 3 a.m. the drivers were at the point of utter exhaustion. The countryside here was once again either flat or at most gently undulating with nothing but hedges, small woods or solitary trees to break the landscape, which, except for the occasional church spire, lacked all other distinguishing features. Then there was the dust cloud which settled on the shoulder-height hedges, making the heat even less bearable. On the 19th we covered 30 kilometres and spent the night in the small town of Loon. We had had no contact with the enemy who, by this time, had retreated behind the Loire, and only units in the divisional vanguard experienced any regular exchange of gunfire. They were the men who had been given the task of seizing the Loire bridges. In Loon, Lieutenant Metz, commander of the 14th Company, and I bunked down in a small chateau surrounded by manicured parkland set in the centre of town. The owners had fled and had left everything behind just as it was. The place had a distinct smell and atmosphere that made me think of an earlier time, and indeed there was nothing in the house that might have belonged to a more modern era. Nearly everything reminded me of my grandmother's house, which I had last visited in 1918, and which had even then seemed to be frozen in time. In the chateau there must have been a number of children, judging by the many small beds upstairs and the straw hats in the hall. From the general appearance of the many bedrooms, the children appeared to have been well brought up, but all in the spirit of 1905. I was deeply moved, for I felt I had entered into my mother's childhood nursery. On the morning of the 20th of June, in another of those brilliant, cloudless, hot, sunny days of which we had had so many that month, I took over the first company of the regiment, the former commander having come down with an infection. During the course of the morning, while on the march, one of the two lieutenants related the history of the company, and in doing so, made me familiar with the company NCOs. The day flew by, and following a marching distance of some 40 kilometres, we arrived at our overnight quarters in a small village on the east bank of the river Mayenne. In the cool of the next morning, we crossed the Mayenne south of Château-Gontier, stopped for a midday break in a small wood on the periphery of Lucyon before reaching Saint-Germain, a small town roughly 2 kilometres north of the Loire. During the last stretch, we had to be especially vigilant and mount guards on every vehicle before reaching our destination at 11 p.m., in an unusually violent thunderstorm. That evening, Captain Hartmann, the former commander of the first company, found his way back to the company. He had refused to be transported to the rear and, following a few days to recover, had made his way back to the regiment. He was a reserve officer and a veteran of the First World War. I accompanied the 1st Battalion on its early morning crossing of the Loire before, on orders from the regiment, attaching myself to the 14th Company. Our foremost units were still in the thick of it. We came upon a prominently situated church with a roof that had been shattered by a direct hit, which no doubt must have chased off the French artillery observer. This village, like so many others, was colourless and poor. Its houses were built of grey stone blocks with only a few applied with a dull plaster. Most building doorways resembled cave openings, and yet they boasted lofty names such as Café de la Ville or Hôtel aux Pêcheurs. The wretched village, in its state of decay, could easily have been a squalid Bosnian mountain settlement. Thanks to my special assignment, I was able to explore some of the Loire Valley with its many wineries and old castles, situated between the towns of Montjean and Angers, which made for a welcome change. The valley with its high river banks offered a pleasing contrast to the overall character of the landscape. Only the incredibly neglected villages, with their drab stone buildings and absence of all colour, remained depressing dark splashes on the scenery. Estates and chateau parklands likewise appeared much neglected, and even the buildings in the city of Angers were no less run down and in dire need of repair. Upon entering the town from the west, we noticed a red and white painted castle which must have been there during the wars between England and France, and now stood as a silent reminder of the time when France had been a cleaner, more robust nation. On the 23rd, I was finally ordered to leave the 14th Company and assume command of the 7th Company, whose former boss, a Captain Wickert, was being transferred to the infantry school in Doberitz. This involved a move to the tiny village of Jalais, where the 2nd Battalion of the 58th Regiment was stationed. Coincidentally, I was back with the same battalion that had welcomed me at its evening meal in the village of Remoulade. On the evening of the 24th, the battalion staff held a small farewell celebration for Captain Wickert, which was followed at 1:30 a.m. by the general announcement of a ceasefire. In response to the news, the entire battalion, illuminated by a huge bonfire, paraded before the village church, and in a short address, Colonel Clampt spoke of the significance of the moment. During the period immediately following the cessation of hostilities, on a day filled with even more sunshine than the one before, a few of us took off in 2 separate vehicles for the Atlantic coast. The road led via Nantes, Saint-Nazaire to La Baule, where we lunched until 3 in the afternoon on the servings of an excellent French cuisine. That was followed by a shopping expedition purchasing everything from silk underwear, cloth for both winter and summer suits, ladies' shoes, children and ladies' clothes, overcoats and socks. We presented an odd image of frenzied shoppers disturbing an otherwise quiet, orderly business street scene in Nantes, where some of the older buildings in the city centre reminded one of the Edict of Nantes. The edict had been preceded by bloody religious wars, which no doubt had killed off some of the country's best. The Edict of Nantes was signed by the French King Henry IV, and marked the end of a long and bitter religious war. It gave a large measure of religious freedom to the Huguenots, French Protestants. Not only in the smaller towns and villages was there an all-pervading atmosphere of despair and decay, but also in the city of Nantes, where the overall shabbiness reached into the very centre of town. Sadly, none of the residents seemed to find these conditions anything but normal. The many cracked and crumbling house facades often defied description, and upon venturing into a back alley or into the inner courtyard of a top hotel, I was overcome by the stench and the sheer volume of animal and human excrement. But now back to our side trip, which had another more compelling purpose, and that was to drop off the battalion's paymaster. It was his job to catalogue the vast stores that hadn't yet been seized, and to requisition anything for the battalion that might be useful. For a long time thereafter, the battalion relied on English tinned food, fruit, boots, shoes, and many other useful items, and even weeks later, the gasoline for our booty vehicles came from the same source in Nantes. Ever eager to be on the move again, I was happy to see the battalion set off again, and this time towards the coast via the towns of Lavernay and Mean until we finally arrived at Saint-Nazaire. Struggling under the excessive summer heat, I know we all yearned to be at the sea. At first all we saw were a few English trucks in the ditch along with one or two armoured cars before we came upon road signs marked "Slow," "Danger," or "Keep left." These pointed to an RAF camp or depot containing new barrack buildings, gutted vehicles, and a mountain of debris. The RAF camp might have been in Lavernay, or in another small town on the edge of the mighty River Loire. At a point where the road approaches the water's edge and drops down via several hairpin bends, I was able to look down onto the wharves and sheds of Saint-Nazaire and out into the western sky. Despite being already late afternoon, the sun still scorched our faces, and the asphalt on the paved roads seemed to melt under our wheels. We entered the suburbs of Saint-Nazaire, and about 5 meters to our right, a vast black and silent industrial complex arose out of the ground. On our left, a curious grey and yellow sight greeted us, which, upon closer examination, turned out to be hundreds of closely parked English trucks and cars, which had been left behind. Among them stood entire rows of ambulances and anti-aircraft guns, still in position, and everything was marked with the lettering RAF. Blackened vehicle skeletons showed that someone, possibly workers from nearby housing, had attempted to set the car park alight. We drove the length of the field, which stretched for almost a full kilometre until we came to a damaged canal bridge, proof that this stretch of the road had been within our artillery range. Following our own white directional boards, we made our way out of town towards the west, where the landscape took on more and more of a coastal character with isolated dunes, small pine woods, and even a lake. Before arriving at the beach resort of La Baule, we came upon an interesting sight. Beside the road was an airfield packed with brand-new, partially painted American-made aircraft, along with rooftop-high stacks of crates containing airplane parts all bearing distinct American markings. It was a fantastic sight. Then we were in La Baule, a place that resembled any German swimming resort with its deep sand dunes, pine woods, and beach huts, and where life in town and on the beach appeared unchanged from before the war. The colourful scene was, however, mixed with a touch of grey, for out in the bay lay a steamer on its side, shifting helplessly with the changing tides, so that at high water it was barely visible, and at low tide showed its full exposure. We bought our swimwear in a nearby shop, and our changing room was the car, but, despite a valiant effort, we were unable to do more than wet our feet, for the tide was out, and to reach deeper water would have taken too long. Our return journey followed the same route in reverse via Valais and Beaupro, before finally reaching Jalais. On one of the last days in June, long before the sun was up, the battalion left Jalais and headed south into the regimental sector around Poitiers. On a 2-day march passing east of Cholet, via Bresnice, we finally reached Parthenay, where we remained for a day of rest. In my free time I explored the old but extensive town fortifications stemming from the French-English War, which left me deeply impressed by the vigour and beauty the town must once have had. In the poorer outlying quarters, in stark contrast to today's uniformly ugly box-like construction, there still stood medieval residential and commercial buildings. Many of these older houses were of minutely carved post and beam structure with one floor stacked above the other, and what was now a wretched laneway would have once been the gateway into town. Although still standing to this day, all buildings were in a dreadful state of decay and covered with the filth of today's generation. Entering another side street, I came upon the entrance to a chapel with a magnificent example of an early Roman archway. In Germany, this structure would have been one of the town's main attractions, but here it was allowed to crumble, and it was not until we reached Poitiers that we really began to understand just how richly blessed France is, with wonderful examples of early Roman architecture. 2 more days of marching brought the regiment to Poitiers, and on July 7th, having paraded before the divisional commander, Lieutenant General Count von Biegeleben, the men took up their quarters. The 2nd Battalion remained as guard battalion in the city, while the rest occupied the former French army barracks in Dalesmees. The state of these barracks was at first beyond description, but during our 4-week stay, we transformed the place into a splendid example of German spit and polish. Officers were lodged in empty houses on Rue de Jean Jaurès and Rue Carnot, and while out on my many bicycle inspection tours, I got to know the town quite well along with its many historical monuments. Compared to France, Germany's few Roman remains are a poor second best indeed. While history and climate have largely preserved these magnificent edifices, the laziness and ignorance of the local authorities was criminal in allowing irreversible harm to be done, especially where Roman building stones had been removed and used for new buildings. The most impressive view of the city was to be had from the eastern bank of the River Claine, where once Admiral Coligny began his siege, but who, in the end, had to abandon his attempt to seize the town. Coligny was a famous Protestant who was leader in the French religious wars. Exploring Poitiers, I was reminded of how the French prefer to withdraw from the outside, that is from the street, and live like Orientals behind their walls in backyards and gardens. A glance into an open doorway or gate offered a fascinating glimpse into tidy rooms, bright gravel-covered yards and beautiful old gardens, the latter often laid out either in strict Roman style or in the manner of the more carefree Baroque. The streets, on the other hand, were dirty, and any regulation governing the handling of garbage was rare. Much as in the Middle Ages, on market day dogs dragged the rubbish into the alleys where washing-up water flowed freely in the gutters, and the manner of garbage collection, which I had the chance to observe on one occasion, bore no resemblance to that of Germany. The appearance of the town's citizens was no more encouraging than what we had encountered earlier, and were perhaps even more seedy and debased. Only once or twice did I come upon a father and son or a father and daughter who, tall, confident and direct, were worthy of a backward glance. Even the swimming pool next to the River Claine, which we sometimes frequented, offered a no more positive image of the youth of Poitiers. In the vicinity of the railway station, there we found an endless column of refugee cars and trucks, some broken down, others out of fuel, but most stopped because the German authorities or the prefecture had put a halt to the continued traffic flow. Not surprisingly, the station building was home to a mass of people, many of whom had already been there for 4 or 5 days. Because of our relative isolation from everyday French life, it was only through local newspapers that we learned something of the suffering endured by this modern-day human migration. On a warm, sunny day at the start of August, my company took up its new quarters in the pretty little town of Lusignan, situated some 20 kilometres south of Poitiers. There we moved into 6 side-by-side standing refugee barracks at the edge of town, which, over the course of the next few days, were cleaned and made presentable. Although our time in Lusignan was cheerful and relaxed, and later looked back upon with pleasure, the one negative was the miserable swimming establishment known as the Plage. Nonetheless, we played lively games of handball, carried out violent water battles in which rows of heavy canoes were regular, swamped by attacking swimmers, and generally we enjoyed the light-hearted splashing of all ranks. This daily romp was almost always carried out under a glowing August sun with skies of indescribable blue and nights of beauty and heat. I myself had lodgings with an attorney, and relished the clean rooms and the grand view over a garden of Italian design. During the week of the 10th to the 17th of August, I participated in an instructional course, the subject of which was landing troops on a foreign shore, and this was held in the small seaside community of L'Aiguillon, northwest of La Rochelle. Facing us was the long drawn-out island of Ré, where at its widest point we could just make out the port of Saint Martin, a place from where in the past French rebels had been deported. Its medieval stone walls and forts glistened in the morning sun, and again in the evening, as the angle of the sinking light caressed the stone work. To the southwest, the loading cranes and storages silos of the old Huguenot fortress of La Rochelle reached into the sky, and despite being kept very busy, a week in the sunshine beside the sea was a recovery of sorts. Our return journey took place on a burning, hot Sunday afternoon via Fontenay-le-Comte, Niort, Saint-Mexan, and was particularly memorable because a huge truck laden with wine barrels travelling ahead of us ran into a tree on the road leading into Niort. We managed to extract the driver from the wreck and deliver him to the hospital in Niort, where, I expect, he succumbed from his serious injuries. It was in Lusignan where I experienced the unhappy event which led to the second reprimand of my career. Before my departure, I had handed my Batman a secret document with instructions to hand it over to my replacement, a Lieutenant Leder who, despite assurances from my Batman, claimed never to have received it. The matter was thoroughly investigated at regimental level, and in the end I was found to be at fault. It was thought I had left the papers in my quarters from where they had been stolen by my host, an occurrence which I always thought most unlikely. Nonetheless, a few days later, I was summoned to regimental headquarters situated in an elegant chateau, where Colonel von Tresco read me the Riot Act and declared how I had come off lightly. Much more pleasant in memory was the exquisitely beautiful 7-kilometre bicycle ride up to the chateau. Further investigation revealed that Lieutenant Leder had indeed received the document, but had misplaced it. That event aside, a more enjoyable day was spent with my company at the seaside near the town of Royan. To reach this delightful swimming beach, we drove again via Niort, came in sight of Rochefort before crossing the Charente, the river down which Napoleon had been taken into exile to the island of St. Helena, nearly 130 years before. On another occasion, First Lieutenant Huttmann, our Dr. Gnadflieg and I drove down to Bordeaux, and a lasting memory from that 200-kilometre drive was the pretty medieval town of Angoulême, with its many towers and battlements and citizens who appeared untouched by the magnitude of the disaster that had overcome their country. Bordeaux, on the other hand, was restless, ill at ease and better informed as to the severity of events, and an understandable yet unpleasant aspect were the crowds frantically buying up everything in the shops. On the 30th of August, we left our much-beloved Lusignan, and, in an overnight march, reached a railway station 4 kilometres north of Poitiers, where, in the grey morning hours, the battalion was loaded onto trains. During the course of that day, we passed through Tours, Le Mans, and up to Château-Gontier on the River Mayenne, where we officers were assigned private lodgings. The last 10 days of hot and sunny weather, with clear, deep blue skies, now abandoned us, and when on the evening of the 10th we continued on, the weather did a complete about-turn. That night we celebrated with the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Clampt, until 9 a.m., and when I tried to snatch a half-hour shut-eye before the coming night march, I found a telegram on my desk announcing the birth of my daughter Mary. Patricia and Mary were both well, and the baby was already 3 days old. With this wonderful news, I passed the next 3 night marches riding contentedly in the saddle of my trusty East Prussian horse, or happily striding on foot alongside the men of my company. On our first night, the battalion slept in a squalid little village in the vicinity of Bourgneuf, northwest of Laval. The second night south of St. James, and by the third we had reached Avranches and took up residence in the town of Bressay to the northeast. This was the beginning of a new chapter in the life of my company in France. Whereas life in Poitiers had been generally monotonous, Lusignan, although demanding work-wise, had been more relaxed and the days in Château-Gontier for the most part stiflingly hot, so our time in Bressay had its own distinct character marked by autumn weather and the lasting impression of endless hedgerows. My quarters were with a couple of elderly ladies who were quite content to replace a lively, fun-loving former lodger with a somewhat quieter, although equally fun-loving new resident. On market days in Bressay, I was given an excellent opportunity to explore the small town and study some of the country folk of Normandy, who seemed to be a healthy mix of small, swarthy types and lively, portly farmers, the latter trotting into town wearing fresh white collars and riding in on their high 2-wheel pony traps. Even the horses were of interest and reminded me of the medieval steeds of jousting knights, big and strong, and capable of carrying great weight, but also nimble and temperamental. The jungle-like landscape, with its countless small farms surrounded by stone walls and thick hedges, reminded me of parts of Poland, an impression reinforced by the scattered outbuildings, their thatched roofs, and the many cottonwood trees. Aside from the cottonwoods, the other trees most often seen were in apple orchards, and just as Pomerania is famous for its potatoes, so is Normandy for its apples. In nearly every garden, heaps of apples lay out in the open until even after Christmas, when they are pressed into cider. To augment our own menu during our stay, we naturally made good use of the abundance of fruit. While in Brécey, the entire battalion participated in a landing exercise in and around Barfleur on the Cherbourg Peninsula, before being transferred on October 6th by a divisional motorized supply column via Saint-Lô and Valognes to our new base of operations. My company was assigned to the tiny fishing village of Gâteville, where, from bright and spotless lodgings, I could look out over the channel and observe its many changing colours. Immediately upon entering my new lodgings, I made friends with 4 of the family's ancestors, whose heavily framed portraits hung in the main room. They undoubtedly were men and women who would have rightly hated my presence, yet, despite their dark, glowering looks, I felt at ease in their frozen gaze. Our landing exercises were limited to the use of fish cutters, inflatable rafts, and firing exercises from sea to land. In the afternoon, like birds of prey, the Luftwaffe gathered high above us, ready to fly their sorties over England. The air was then filled with a deep and regular roar, which from time to time was interrupted by the high-pitched whine of a sharply climbing aircraft. On most warm, moonlit nights, we could also hear the lighter sound of high-flying English bombers, leaving thin contrails of condensation penciled across the sky. During the pursuit of the enemy south of the Seine, on the 15th or the 16th of June, the 7th Company had come face to face with 3 heavy 32-ton French tanks, and for a time the situation appeared critical. While stationed in Brécey, I had received orders from the regimental commander to make inquiries among the NCOs of the 7th Company for the purpose of securing recommendations for the awarding of the Knight's Cross. In response, I dutifully called the platoon leaders together, who uniformly and unhesitatingly declared that at no time had there been an occasion when the awarding of a medal, let alone the Knight's Cross, was warranted. With that, I reported my findings to the regimental commander, thinking that the matter would then be closed. To my astonishment, Colonel von Tresco grew angry and demanded that a recommendation be presented to him forthwith, whereupon I replied that, as their new company commander, I could hardly order my platoon leaders to make statements they knew to be false. The colonel then completely lost his temper, jumped to his feet, broke the pencil in his hand, threw the pieces to the floor, and shouted that unless I had what he asked for next morning, I would be in for it. This was my second spot of trouble with my regimental commander, but I too was angry. What happened after that, I can't exactly say, but guessed that Colonel von Issendorf had somehow got involved. There followed much tiresome work in compiling medal commendations, which, in the end, came to naught. I suspected that the higher-ups had guessed at their doubtful value. The small village of Gâteville offered much to contemplate. Out of a population of perhaps about 300, nearly 40 men had perished during the Great War, and no doubt, as a consequence, there were now a high number of houses either already in ruins or about to collapse. Even then, with whole families uprooted, their menfolk in distant POW camps, and the women and children as refugees or living with grandparents, there were many vacant yet still fully furnished houses in which members of my company made themselves at home. On or about the 13th of October, I had the opportunity to visit Cherbourg, and a lasting impression from this fleeting visit was the stark contrast between the America Quay, the gateway to Europe, for the steady stream of visitors from across the Atlantic, and the filthy, dilapidated harbour town set next door. I look back on the town of Saint-Malo with affection, for it was there we had been driven during our 10-day stay at Château-Gontier. The place was a uniquely charming old pirate town with magnificent beaches, and I silently vowed to return with Patricia during the hot days of a future summer. On the 30th of October, our Brécey stay came to an end. A convoy of trucks transported the entire battalion to the town of Granville and its surroundings, where we were about to be deployed as part of the coastal defences. This is of particular interest because this was a clear signal that, following the Luftwaffe's failure to subdue the RAF, more commonly known as the Battle of Britain, all landing exercises came to an end as Hitler, who had never been enthusiastic about invading Britain, abandoned his plans to cross the Channel and began to look east towards Russia. The 7th Company found itself stationed in Joulouville, a drawn-out beach resort approximately 7 kilometres south of Granville. Quite a number of tidy little beach huts stood empty alongside a casino and several elaborate villas, the last becoming the new divisional headquarters, until the cold forced them to be moved to the Hotel Normandy in Granville. Only General Baron von Biegeleben, the divisional commander, preferred to remain in Joulouville, where he however sadly died of a heart attack, and was buried in the small church cemetery. Along with Lieutenant Schmacker, a decent and diligent fellow company officer, I occupied a villa on the beach called Coeur Odette, where from every room, including the brightly spacious upstairs bedrooms, we had a clear view out over the sea and, with a fireplace downstairs to keep us warm, felt very much at home. Later, when we ran short of firewood, we had a coal-burning stove installed which sufficed for the rest of a fairly mild winter. I had taken note of how the temperatures fell and rose depending on the distance to and from the sea. Whereas a mere 40 kilometres inland, it was often less cloudy but much colder. By the sea, the weather remained usually warmer and milder, and the ever-changing colours of the water made our life in Joulouville even more enjoyable. I especially relished my rides along the beach to inspect our sentries, the southernmost position being 8 kilometres distant, but from where a fine view was had over the bay across to Mont Saint-Michel, which, from 7 kilometres away, seemed to rise straight out of the sea. At the beginning of December, we officers were invited to visit Mont Saint-Michel, and were shocked to discover how this remarkable edifice and historical icon had been allowed to fall into such decay. The lack of care was truly depressing, and the condition in which we found the abbey and the church compelled us to compare the cultural values of today's Frenchman and woman to those who had built and once cherished this place. The unanimous conclusion was that they had fallen into sharp decline. On a mild, sunny December day, we received the order to be especially observant. Major Wick, a fighter pilot of growing reputation, was reported to have crashed nearby, and the possibility existed that he was somewhere out there floating around in his life jacket. Nothing was seen of him, however, in those calm, deep blue waters, where a mere 17 kilometres distant, the island of Chaussee sparkled in the sunlight, and further south, the tiny town of Cancale thrust itself into the bay of Mont Saint-Michel. The probability of an enemy landing was so remote that nothing much of interest happened during the course of that entire winter. Aside from coastal defence duties, we were engaged in training 65 new recruits. For accommodation, we used empty beach houses. For a drill ground, a nearby sports field, and for main bat-teal exercises, we used the very suitable surrounding countryside. The inspection took place on the 5th and 6th of February, and our work received favourable mention. I finally succeeded in getting some leave, and at midday on the 30th of December 1940, I was on my way to Paris. To catch my Berlin train, I had to change stations from Gare Montparnasse to Gare du Nord. Leaving Granville, I found myself seated opposite a first lieutenant who wore a badge marking him out as a member of the Reichskultural Society, and whom I recognised as the author F. Blunk. We introduced ourselves and became engaged in an interesting and lively conversation, which continued over a meal at the Gare du Nord, during which he described his visit to the Channel Islands and earlier trips to Riga and Reval in the Baltic states. Despite the much-discussed food shortage, I was astonished to find an abundance of meat, bread, fish and fruit, including bananas and oranges. The Parisians, having just lost the war, just didn't know how good they had it, especially when it came to fruit. With the arrival of first light, we found ourselves in Liège, but unhappily it took until midnight before we pulled into a blacked-out Berlin. The new year was seen on a stretch of railway line between Charlottenburg and Friedrichstrasse, exactly where, on the 9th of June in 1938, I had stood with Patricia in the corridor fearful I would never see her again. I had a 4-hour layover in Bernau before arriving in Old Stettin, and by lunchtime I was in Schönhagen, where it was -5 or 6 degrees, and the snow crunched crisply underfoot. Patricia met me at the station, having driven herself over with coach and pair, and following our joyous reunion, she introduced me to my daughter, who was lying quietly in her basket, examining her fingers, which she seemed to have just discovered. At first she was a little shy, but at the end of the 3 weeks, when I said goodbye to her in her basket, it was another story. Of all the many wonders with Patricia was her love and care for the small child, and I never in my life would have believed how such a small creature could be so quiet, calm and happy, and just being with her was magical. The only unpleasant aspect of my leave was that it slipped by much too quickly, and on the 20th of January it was time to return. I had a long wait in Berlin for my connecting train, so I took the opportunity to stroll through the snow-covered Tiergarten, treading the same path where Patricia and I had walked a year earlier, both happy to be together, yet troubled by our uncertain future. Next morning the train rolled through the Saar region, crossed over the former French defence positions before arriving at Metz. Thereafter the journey continued in a wide arc towards the south to Bar-le-Duc, Chalon-sur-Marne, and finally down the Marne Valley into Paris. In a hotel at the Gare Montparnasse, I remember being struck by how every room had its own bathroom, and immediately recalled how upon returning from London 2 weeks before the outbreak of war, there had not been a single room available with a bath in the entire zoo quarter of Berlin. By 2 p.m. I was once again in Granville, where there was no snow, and the temperature was already spring-like. No sooner had I returned, however, than we received word that we were to be transferred to Paris as a guard unit, and on the 14th of February our transport left Granville railway station. I recall looking back longingly at the last dazzling sunset and richly coloured sea, made briefly visible through a break in the rain. By dawn the next morning we approached Saint-Cyr, the famous French military academy, before passing the parklands of Versailles and crossing the river Seine to the south of Paris. Then, in a wide arc, the train took us through numerous suburbs, until it finally reached the Pantin railway station in the northwest, where at about 2 p.m. we began to unload. Once unloaded, the whole battalion marched eastwards through Montmartre and took up temporary residence in the fortress of Vincennes, only to move 2 days later to neighbouring barracks at Fort Neuf. The fortress of Vincennes left me with a deep impression. However, the journey around the periphery of the city and the following foot march provided further evidence of the dirt and decay, even in neighbourhoods that had once seen better days. In the valley of the River Marne, where there had once been villas filled with life and pretty parks and gardens, there was now only wretchedness and rot, surrounded by the misery of squalid, foul-smelling slums. Whereas suburbs in most cities are generally ugly, disorganised, and a disgrace, what we saw here to the east of Paris was too depressing for words. From a military standpoint, our presence in Paris consisted not only of ceremonial guard duties, but also for purposes of parade and drill display, and although it was often monotonous, the discipline required had a positive effect. First of all, our young soldiers gained something not always granted others. This was a higher degree of confidence and self-respect, which came perhaps from being regularly on display and subconsciously translating itself into the posture and mannerisms of a guardsman. Secondly, there was nothing more important than a drill skillfully carried out before the many critical eyes of people of another nation. In the close vicinity of Fort Neuf, where there was a large quantity of rusting German equipment from 1918, there was also a large depot filled with recently seized French military equipment, where repair commandos and workshop mechanics were busy examining the many vehicles of all different makes and sizes for the purpose of transporting the salvageable ones to German motorized units. The sheer number of vehicles, and how they were being made ready for transportation into the Reich, might have given many a Frenchman much cause for bitter resentment. Crashed nearby, and the possibility existed that he was somewhere out there floating around in his life jacket. Nothing was seen of him, however, in those calm, deep blue waters, where a mere 17 kilometres distant the island of Chaussee sparkled in the sunlight, and further south the tiny town of Cancale thrust itself into the bay of Mont-Saint-Michel. The probability of an enemy landing was so remote that nothing much of interest happened during the course of that entire winter. Aside from coastal defence duties, we were engaged in training 65 new recruits. For accommodation we used empty beach houses, for a drill ground a nearby sports field, and for main battle exercises we used the very suitable surrounding countryside. The inspection took place on the 5th and 6th of February, and our work received favourable mention. I finally succeeded in getting some leave, and at midday on the 30th of December 1940 I was on my way to Paris. To catch my Berlin train, I had to change stations from Gare Montparnasse to Gare du Nord. Leaving Granville, I found myself seated opposite a first lieutenant who wore a badge marking him out as a member of the Reichskultural Society, and whom I recognized as the author F. Blunk.